Recently, as you might be aware if you follow this channel or my Instagram, I went to the celebrations for the 200th anniversary of the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and therefore the 200th anniversary of the dawn of the railway age. At the centre of all this was Locomotion, the first locomotive ever to operate over the Stockton and Darlington Railway. This engine and its working replica have been all over the place this year spreading the good word, but a question has been nagging me. Is locomotion actually that important? This probably sounds like blasphemy, so I'm going to have to explain myself. So the basics. Locomotion is a steam engine built in 1825 to a design by George Stephenson. It hauled the first train at the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which makes it the first locomotive on a public railway. Let's be clear. Locomotion is not the first steam locomotive. That was probably Richard Trevithick's Penny Darren locomotive of 1804. It's not the first steam locomotive to haul passengers. That was Richard Trevithick's Catch Me Who Can of 1808, although I can't believe nobody hitched a lift on the Penny Darren locomotive. Locomotion did not represent a leap forward in railway technology like George and Robert Stephenson's later rocket. What makes it notable is not what it was, but where. What was actually notable was the public railway. When locomotion was built, it was very much the early days of the steam train. Railways were typically simple tramways used for transporting coal from mines to canals or ports. The engines using them were slow, heavy, and primitive, and there weren't many of them. Each new locomotive represented a step forward in understanding this new technology, but it was a shuffle rather than a stride. Innovations and minor improvements introduced piecemeal. George Stephenson had begun his career as a blacksmith's apprentice. He became particularly interested in steam power while working at Killingworth Colliery. And fortunately, he was surrounded by fellow engineers and employers who encouraged this interest. Having observed the work of other locomotive pioneers, Stephenson built a locomotive named either Blucher or My Lord. A recurring theme in this history is that there's a lot we don't know, get used to that. Whatever it was called, it was first tried in 1814. He followed this up with a second locomotive in 1815, co-designed with Ralph Dodds. He would follow this up with 5 engines for Killingworth, 5 for Hetton Colliery, and a couple of outliers. Each one represented an incremental improvement. Stephenson's knowledge of locomotives also gave him a greater understanding of railways as a whole. By the middle of the 1820s, he was arguably the most knowledgeable railway engineer in the world. He managed to impress a businessman named Edward Pease. Pease was a Quaker. Back then, Quakers weren't allowed to enter Parliament or the universities, so the only option for a smart lad was to go into business. And Quakers were pretty good at that, as shady practices were literally against their religion. Poor quality work, unfair prices, and debt were akin to theft in their eyes, so they were seen as trustworthy. Pease had become interested in improving transport for the collieries of County Durham. In an age when roads were generally poor and railways were short, horse-drawn tramways, water was still the favoured means of long-distance transport, but the problem was getting coal from the mines to the ships. Initially, a Stockton and Darlington Canal was suggested. The engineer who was engaged on the project, George Overton, favoured a railway. Longer railways, or tramways as they were often termed back then, had existed for some time at that point. For instance, the Surrey Iron Railway had opened in 1803. The concept began to take shape. This would be a public railway, which in those days meant something like a toll road. Users would pay to send their wagons over the railway. Pease liked the concept, but he thought he could do better than Overton, and so he summoned Stephenson. Stephenson agreed to build the railway and presented Pease with the idea that would put the Stockton and Darlington in the history books. A public railway worked by steam locomotives. Evidently he was a better speaker than history books often paint him as, because he was able to persuade Pease to go along with it. Overton, by contrast, argued that a locomotive on the public road would be a perpetual nuisance and favoured horses as the motive power. But he was drowned out by the metaphorical hiss of steam. In 1823, Stephenson founded Robert Stephenson and Company with his son, Robert, to build locomotives. He resigned from the company in an official capacity quite early on due to the obvious conflict of interest in having the same guy build the railway and supply the locomotives. Locomotion would be the first engine completed by the company. Now, there's a lot we don't know about locomotion in its early days. We know that it didn't look like this, and it wasn't called locomotion. The Stockton and Darlington Railway referred to it as the company's locomotive, or number 1, and Robert Stephenson and Company referred to it as the improved travelling engine. Apparently from the outset it carried the nickname of Active. This replica in Hopetown represents what we think it probably looked like, albeit it was described as being brightly painted on delivery. We have rough sketches and conflicting accounts about its actual form, but no actual plan and of course no photographs. It was a development of Stephenson's Killingworth locomotives, but larger and more powerful for the greater distance. Otherwise, though, it doesn't appear to have been anything particularly special mechanically. But it's not what it was that made it famous, but where it was and when. In 1825, the engine that would become locomotion was delivered by road to Hyington, where the station now stands. A crowd gathered to see the engine hauled onto the rails, and George Stephenson and his brother James recruited a number of them to assist. The first ever passengers on the Stockton and Darlington Railway were one Crawford Marley and 2 of his friends, 13-year-old boys who were given a ride as thanks for helping to light the fire and fill the boiler. On the 26th of September, after much testing, a VIP train for the directors was laid on from Shildon to Darlington. For this, they were carried in the passenger carriage experiment. Now, this coach has been depicted in wildly different forms. It's often shown as looking something like a garden shed on wheels, which seems to be based on nothing at all. Other accounts have it looking more like a stagecoach, which has a certain logic to it. This, however, is more or less what we now think it looked like, albeit this replica includes a number of compromises for the sake of safety. More on that in a bit. The legend it carries, Periculum Privatum Utilitas Publica, was the motto of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and translates to private risk for public use. And the following day, the 27th of September, the railway officially opened. The journey began here at what was once the Mason's Arms in Shildon. The train at the S&DR Festival consisted of 3 children wagons and experiment, but the load back in 1825 was considerably greater. 43 wagons plus experiment, plus coal, flour and nearly 700 passengers. The train took 3 hours to reach Darlington following a number of mishaps, then a further 3.5 hours to get to Stockton. Something in the region of 50,000 spectators gathered to watch the train go by. And this, to many, represents the dawn of the railway age. But the Stockton and Darlington was not a railway in the modern sense. It had no signals, no timetable, no stations. Its passenger trains were usually horse-drawn, as were many of its goods trains. The concept of the railway as we would understand it really came with the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1829, and the Stockton and Darlington would later adopt many of those innovations. Still, a steam locomotive operating on a public railway wasn't nothing. It was proof that locomotives could be more than mere plodding plant machinery. Locomotion's working career was not especially glamorous. After opening day, it was used exclusively on goods trains, which was the case for all the locomotives in those early days. It was not a very powerful locomotive, although its crews considered it to be well made. Its top speed with a load was typically around 12 miles per hour. That doesn't sound like much, but Stephenson's first locomotive could only do 3. It had no springs and a tendency to lose steam on bumpy track due to the safety valve being jogged open. In 1828, the engine would suffer an unfortunate mishap when the boiler flue collapsed, causing the engine to explode and killing the driver, John Cree. The company's locomotive superintendent, the highly regarded Timothy Hackworth, decided that it should be rebuilt with a double return flue. The flue in the boiler acted much like the heating element in a kettle. A pipe conveying hot gas from the fire to heat the water and generate steam, then eject it out of the funnel. A double return flue was what it sounds like, providing far more heating area. Locomotion returned from its rebuild with a larger boiler, new cylinders, and 2 chimneys at the back of the engine. We have no contemporary illustrations of this. It probably also ran with 2 tenders, one for water at the front and one for coal at the back. Now, I've been calling it Locomotion, but it wasn't officially named that until 1833, when the company decided it should give its engines names. Locomotion is hardly the biggest engine I've ever seen, but in 1834 it was considered to be too heavy for the track, causing unnecessary wear. So Hackworth swapped the boiler out with the smaller one of locomotive number 4, Diligence. This had a single return flue, meaning that Locomotion would now have 1 chimney at the back. Again, there are no known contemporary images of this. Despite all this, by the end of the 1830s, Locomotion was firmly outclassed by newer engines. It was demoted from coal trains to the lighter general goods trains and maintenance trains. In 1840 it was handed over to the Shildon Works Company. Thereafter it only appears to have been used fairly sparingly. By the 1850s it was being used as a pumping engine at coal mines. By 1856 its place in railway history was recognised, and the directors wanted to preserve it. William Bush, the then locomotive superintendent, reported that it could be rebuilt to its original form for approximately £50. Now, returning it to its original form is rather stretching things. Bush used whatever period-appropriate parts he could find from the railway's stores to restore the engine to what they thought it originally looked like, and an entirely new tender was built. In 1857 it was put on public display in Darlington, the first purposely preserved steam locomotive, and that is the form in which it became known to posterity. This is just a condensed history of the locomotive. It had a number of other modifications that we know of, and may have had several more, but the records just don't survive. What a recent archaeological survey has determined is that nothing of the original locomotive remains. Trigger's broom, grandfather's axe, the ship of Theseus, call it what you like, but the locomotion that exists today is the locomotion of 1825 in name only. Well, except it's not even that, because it wasn't called Locomotion back then. The thing is, that form, the much rebuilt and inaccurately restored form, is the one in which it would become world famous. In 1875 it took part in the 50th anniversary of the railway's opening. In 1881 it was part of a lineup of historic locomotives assembled for the centenary of George Stephenson's birth. In 1925 it took part in another centenary celebration, this time its own. It was powered by a petrol engine housed in a replica of its replica tender. I have a newspaper report on the event, but I'm a little nervous about taking it out of its protective sleeve. It wore the number 54, which the replica carried this year. In 1975, it celebrated its 150th birthday along with a newly built working replica. And this year it's been touring the country to celebrate another 50 years. That replica is pretty notable in itself. It's based on the preserved version of the locomotive, but under the skin it's very different. With George and Robert's later engine, Rocket, single and return flues went out of style to be replaced with the far more efficient multi-tube boiler. In 1995, replica Locomotion got a multi-tube boiler, or partially multi-tube anyway. Don't ask me to explain how it works. That rather wide chimney conceals a far narrower pipe, which increases the speed of the flow of air through the firebox, meaning that it burns fuel more efficiently. Also increasing the airflow is a blower fitted to the tender, which is electrically powered because we live in the future. And it now uses coal briquettes rather than conventional coal, which burn with less waste and prevent the boiler from getting furred up. It might be historically accurate to have the boiler getting clogged up every few miles, but it's not exactly practical. The axle boxes have been modified, which means the engine runs smoothly and doesn't suffer from bent coupling rods anymore. Many of these alterations followed testing on the Weardale Railway prior to S&DR 200. The result is a better engine than it was in 1975 and far better than the original. In fact, it has steam to spare these days and was often immersed in its own personal cloud. The train behind it also conceals secrets. The replica of Experiment provides the necessary braking power for Locomotion to operate on the main line. It also has a horn, which is weird. As for the children wagons in front of it, the first wagon carries an additional water tank, the second, more coal, and the third, a compressor to power the brakes and to back the blower up. The train essentially forms a single unit while operating on the main line. As a little Easter egg, the first wagon is numbered 279, or the 27th of September. And while the loco crews of 1825 were on their own if the engine failed, the replica has an allocated diesel locomotive to rescue it if it runs into difficulty. Appropriately number 66-200. This coupling makes Locomotion compatible with modern locomotives. Neither locomotion is truly authentic, but that certainly doesn't seem to have bothered the crowds gathered at S&DR 200. There were one or two online voices raised in protest, but I think they're kind of missing the point. It's not that people don't know that the engine is inauthentic. Nobody is pretending it is exactly the engine that it was in 1825. But it's more that it's not that important in the grand scheme of things. In its current form, Locomotion is an icon. It's an emblem of Darlington. It was on the £5 note. It's a symbol of the early railways. No one living today has seen the locomotive in its original form, or even really knows what it looked like. But this engine is known worldwide. Locomotion isn't just a machine at this point. It's a legend. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. My main sources for today's video were Locomotion No. 1 by Michael R. Bailey and Peter H. Davidson, Before Rocket by Anthony Dawson, The Early Pioneers of Steam by Stuart Hilton, Stockton and Darlington Railway by Kay Hoole, and a couple of conversations I had with Steve Davies. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the Edward Pease to my Stockton and Darlington Railway. And I shall see you all again very soon. Cheerio.